quiz! Who was the first woman in space? Many of you probably just answered Dr. Sally Ride, who launched aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger on June 18, 1983. But you'd be wrong. Sally Ride was the first American woman in space, not the first overall. That honor belongs to a now scarcely remembered Russian woman who, all the way back in August 1963, became not only the first woman, but only the 12th person in history to rocket into the final frontier. This is the forgotten story of Valentina Tereshkova. On April 9, 1959, the newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, announced its selection for the first American astronauts. Known as the Mercury 7, its members were all drawn from the ranks of military test pilots. Less than a year later, on February 25, 1960, the rival Soviet space program selected its own slate of 20 cosmonauts, all pilots in the Soviet Air Force. In sharp contrast to the very public and civilian-operated American space program, the Soviet program was run by the military and shrouded in official secrecy. Thus, unlike the Mercury 7, who became instant celebrities, fated across the United States and the world, the names of the first cosmonauts were kept tightly under wraps, only to be revealed after they successfully reached orbit. Over the following year, the two programs raced neck and neck to place the first man in space, until on April 12, 1961, 27-year-old cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin blasted off from Baikonur Cosmodrome, Kazakhstan, aboard the spacecraft Vostok 1, completing one orbit before safely returning to Earth. This historic achievement was followed by a flurry of launches from both sides, with Gagarin being followed into space by Alan Shepard aboard Mercury Redstone 3 on May 5th, Gus Grissom aboard Mercury Redstone 4 on July 21st, and German Titov aboard Vostok 2 on August 6th. By late 1961, however, it became clear to both American and Soviet planners that new blood was needed, especially as both space programs geared up to launch more complex orbital missions and eventually land a man on the moon. The Soviets in particular had suffered significant losses in their cosmonaut corps, with Anatoly Kartashkov and Valentin Varlamov suffering serious injuries in training, and Valentin Bondarenko dying in a horrific fire in a hyperbaric chamber. By the end of 1963, 4 more cosmonauts would also be expelled from the program for disciplinary reasons. The task of selecting replacements fell to General Nikolai Kamanin, director of cosmonaut training, who recommended that an unusual group of candidates be added to the next slate. In 1960 and 1961, a number of articles appeared in the American press about a group of women pilots who underwent the same medical evaluations as the Mercury 7, with several of them scoring even higher than their male counterparts. And for more on this, check out our video, The Largely Forgotten Mercury 13, over on our sister channel Highlight History. Though privately funded and unaffiliated with NASA, these experiments alarmed Kamanin, who declared, "We cannot allow that the first woman in space will be American. This would be an insult to the patriotic feelings of Soviet women." The idea of sending a woman into space delighted Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who was eager to score yet another first over the United States. So, on December 31st, 1962, the Central Committee of the Communist Party approved the recruitment of a new slate of cosmonauts, including 5 women. In order to beat the Americans into space, the women would be selected and trained far ahead of their male colleagues. The Free Will Society for Cooperation with the Army, Aviation and Navy Support, or DOSAF, a paramilitary sport organization founded in 1927, was given the task of scouting out suitable candidates who had to be under 30 years of age, no taller than 170 centimeters, and no heavier than 70 kilograms in order to fit inside the spacecraft and have experience in parachuting. Unlike the male cosmonauts, however, no university degree or even piloting experience was required. This was because, unlike the American Mercury spacecraft, the Vostok capsule was designed to be controlled via radio command from the ground, the cosmonaut only taking manual control in the case of an emergency. Also, while Mercury capsules splashed down in the ocean, for reasons of convenience and secrecy, Vostok capsules landed over the vast territory of the Soviet Union. But since the parachute could not land both the heavy capsule and the cosmonaut inside at a safe velocity, the cosmonaut instead ejected at an altitude of 7 kilometers and parachuted separately to the ground. Interestingly, this design feature was actually kept secret following Yuri Gagarin's historic 1961 spaceflight, because the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, or FAI's official rules regarding spaceflight records specified that an astronaut must return with their spacecraft. In the end, however, they amended the rules, and Gagarin was officially recognized as the first human to make a spaceflight. When the Soviet government announced it was looking for female cosmonaut candidates, some 800 patriotic women from across the nation eagerly submitted their applications. Of this, DOSAF compiled a list of 400 names, eventually whittled down to just 58. On January the 15th, 1962, these 58 dossiers reached General Kamanin, who 4 days later stated, quote, "Yesterday I considered the files of 58 female candidates. Generally disappointed and dissatisfied. Only 23 will be brought to Moscow for medical tests because DOSAF did not examine their credentials correctly. I told them I needed girls who were young, brave, physically strong, and with experience of aviation, who we can prepare for spaceflight in no more than 6 months. The central objective of this accelerated preparation is to ensure that the Americans do not beat us to place the first woman in space." A preliminary round of medical testing whittled the 58 candidates down to just 18. These 18 women were divided into 2 groups of 9 for further evaluation, of which 7 were ultimately eliminated. Of the remaining 11, 5 finalists were selected, the results being finalized on April the 3rd, 1962. These were Tatiana Kuznetsova, age 20, the secretary and champion parachutist with several world records to her name; Valentina Ponomareva, age 28, a pilot and graduate of the Moscow Aviation Institute. Of the final 5, Ponomareva was the only married woman and the only one with children. Irina Solovyova, age 24, an engineer and champion parachutist who had completed over 2,200 parachute jumps; Valentina Tereshkova, age 24, a textile worker and hobby parachutist who had completed 100 jumps; Zhana Yorkina, age 22, a school teacher, fluent in English and German, and an avid skydiver. As the Soviet space program was a military operation, all 5 candidates were temporarily inducted into the Soviet Air Force and given the honorary rank of private. Training was set to begin in April 1962, with launches scheduled for August the following year. The 5 women arrived at the Cosmonaut Training Center outside of Moscow, colloquially known as Star City, in March 1962, around the same time General Kamanin announced the second slate of male cosmonauts. As Valentina Tereshkova later recalled, the women were starstruck by the original cosmonauts assigned to be their guides and mentors. "Let me tell you, when I entered the Star City of cosmonauts, my heart was about to stop. How will they meet me here? I didn't do anything great in my life. In fact, I didn't see much of a real life, and these were real pilots. And 2 of them, Gagarin and Titov, were heroes whose names were known all around the world." But the male astronauts were less enthused about their new female colleagues, with Valentina Pomareva later reporting that the men thought we were completely redundant, that there was no place for a woman on a spacecraft. Especially incensed was Grigory Nelyubov, who was nominally 3rd in line to fly after Yuri Gagarin and German Titov. However, the joint Vostok 3 and 4 missions were ultimately assigned to Andrian Nikolaev and Pavel Popovich, who, being ethnically Chuvash and Ukrainian respectively, were chosen to represent the diversity of the Soviet republics. With the Vostok 6 slot now earmarked for a female cosmonaut, Nelyubov risked being pushed further down the flight rotation. In March 1963, Nelyubov, along with Ivan Anikeyev and Valentin Filatyev, were arrested for drunken and disorderly conduct and expelled from the cosmonaut corps, having never flown in space. He soon descended into depression and alcoholism, committing suicide in February 1966. Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, was more ambivalent about the female cosmonauts, though concerned about the selection of Valentina Pomareva, stating, "Cosmonautics is a known and unsafe world. Can we risk the life of a mother?" He ultimately came around and instructed his fellow cosmonauts, "Some lady cosmonauts are on their way to join us. Let's be considerate and helpful toward them. There must be no teasing or anything else offensive to them." Training for the 5 women began in April 1962 and included intensive sessions in centrifuges, thermal and decompression chambers, isolation chambers, and spacecraft simulators, as well as simulated zero-gravity training in special aircraft flying parabolic arcs, what in American service is known as the Vomit Comet. They were also given basic cockpit instruction in a MiG-15 UTI training aircraft by Colonel Vladimir Syogin, who would later die in the same mysterious 1968 plane crash that took the life of Yuri Gagarin. But while the women were encouraged to take control and get a feel for the aircraft, they were not permitted to fly solo flights. By December 1962, all 5 had risen through the ranks, being commissioned as junior lieutenants. But the strain of the training eventually took its toll, and 2 of the 5 began to fall behind. Zhana Yorkina performed poorly during a simulated 3-day space mission, reportedly even fainting, while even Tatiana Kuznetsova was ultimately forced to stand down due to illness. This left Valentina Pomareva, Irina Solovyova, and Valentina Tereshkova in a neck-and-neck race for the Vostok 6 mission. Finally, on May 21, 1961, General Kamanin announced his decision. "We must send Tereshkova into space first, and her backup will be Solovyova. She is Gagarin in a skirt." Valentina Pomonareva, the only one of the 5 with piloting experience, was shocked by the decision and complained to Yevgeny Karpov, director of Star City, saying, "Trying to console me, Karpov said that political considerations prompted the sending of a person with particular roots, and I had the misfortune of being a clerk." Indeed, despite being arguably the least qualified of the five, Valentina Tereshkova was chosen largely because she more closely fit the proletarian ideal favored by the Soviet regime. Born on March 16, 1937, in the small village of Bolshoy Maslenikovo, 270 kilometers northeast of Moscow, Tereshkova was the eldest daughter of Vladimir Tereshkov, a tractor driver on a collective farm, and Elena Fyodorina, a textile worker. In 1940, when Valentina was only 2, Vladimir, by then a sergeant in the Red Army, was killed while fighting in the Winter War against Finland. After graduating high school at the age of 16, Valentina worked first at a tire factory and then at a textile mill in order to support her family. Meanwhile, she became interested in skydiving and joined the local aero club, making her first parachute jump at the age of 22 on May 21, 1959. I did night jumps too, onto land and water, the Volga River. It's a very different experience, but both are wonderful. I learned to wait as long as possible before pulling the cord, just to feel the air. 40 seconds, 50 seconds. It's not really falling. You experience enormous pleasure from the sensation of your whole body. It's marvelous. Tereshkova had also given more acceptable patriotic answers to questions by the selection board. For example, when asked, "What do you want from life?" Valentina Pomarova replied, "I want to take everything it can offer," while Tereshkova answered, "I want to support irrevocably the Komsomol and Communist Party." Other strikes against Pomarova included a habit of smoking in public and a reputation as a loose woman. Strangely, space program chief designer Sergei Korolev recommended Tereshkova for Vostok 6 precisely because she was less qualified. At the time, Korolev was designing the next generation of Soviet spacecraft, the three-man Voskhod, from which cosmonauts would be able to perform extravehicular activities or spacewalks. Such complex missions required the skills of cosmonauts like Ponomarova and Solovyova, while Tereshkova was more than adequate for the fully automated spam-in-a-can Vostok 6 mission. In other words, Valentina Tereshkova was everything Premier Khrushchev and the propagandists in the Kremlin needed her to be. No more, no less. Originally, it was planned that two women would fly into space together in the joint Vostok 3 and 4 missions, which were successfully flown on August 11th and 12th, 1962. Valentina Tereshkova would launch first aboard the Vostok 5, followed the next day by Valentina Pomarova in Vostok 6. However, at a meeting of the Presidium of the Communist Party on March 21st, 1963, this plan was struck down by member Frol Kozlov and Minister of Defense Dmitry Ustinov, who argued that one woman cosmonaut was sufficient for propaganda purposes and that Vostok 5 should be flown by a male cosmonaut. This led to the flights being delayed by 2 months as cosmonauts Valery Bakovsky and Boris Volyov were hastily trained for their new mission. Ultimately, Bakovsky was chosen as prime crew largely on the basis of weight. A large amount of extra equipment had been added to the capsule to extend its endurance, and Bakovsky weighed 15 kilograms less than Volyov. Volyov, however, remained as Bakovsky's backup pilot. In June 1963, the cosmonauts made their way to Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan to prepare for the historic dual mission. Bakovsky was the first to be launched, climbing the gantry and being strapped into his spacecraft on the morning of June 14th. However, the countdown was fraught with difficulties, with faults in both Bakovsky's ejection seat and the upper stage of the Vostok rocket, causing the launch to be delayed for 4 hours. Volyov, waiting in the cosmonaut transfer van, was told to put on his spacesuit in case Bakovsky needed to be replaced. Thankfully, all the technical issues were worked out before the close of the launch window, and at 2:59 p.m. Moscow time, Bakovsky, given the call sign Yastreb or Hawk, blasted off from the launch pad and rocketed into space. Within a half hour, Vostok 5 had settled into a stable orbit, 200 kilometers, 3% lower than expected due to the malfunctioning upper stage. Otherwise, however, everything was normal. Watching from the launch control room, Tereshkova took the opportunity to send Bakovsky a greeting. Yastreb, Yastreb. So, you recognize my voice. A warm greeting to you. I congratulate you on a good beginning. To which Bakovsky replied, I am waiting. While he waited, Bakovsky carried out a light program of scientific tasks, including photographing the Earth and the Sun's corona, performing experiments on fruit flies and pea plants, and measuring his own body's reactions to weightlessness. Finally, on June 16th, it was Valentina Tereshkova's turn to make history. She and her backup, Irina Solovyova, donned their spacesuits and climbed into the transfer van that would carry them to the launch pad. It was then that an incident occurred which could have cost Tereshkova her date with destiny. While suiting up, the fabric near the neck seal of Solovyov's spacesuit tore, forcing her to switch to Valentina Ponomareva's suit. Had this happened to Tereshkova, there would have been no replacement suit, for Tereshkova was taller and stockier than her two backups. In that case, Ponomareva would have flown the mission. In the event, however, Tereshkova's suit held, and when she reached the launch pad, she performed what is still a hallowed Baikonur good luck ritual. Prior to his launch on April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin had urinated on the back left tire of the transfer van. Before climbing the stairs to the elevator, Tereshkova did the same, becoming the first woman to do so. Unlike with Baikovsky 2 days earlier, Tereshkova's countdown proceeded without incident, and at 12:30 p.m. Moscow time, Vostok 6 blasted off the launch pad. Within minutes, Tereshkova, given the call sign Cheka or Seagull, became not only the first woman, but also the first civilian to reach outer space. As she rose higher and higher into the sky, she jubilantly exclaimed, "It is I, Seagull. Everything is fine. I see the horizon. It's a sky blue with a dark strip. How beautiful the Earth is. Everything is going well." And, as promised, Valery Bukovsky was waiting for her. When the spaceship Vostok 6 was to be put into orbit, I knew in advance at what time. I had my radio receiving apparatus switched on at the time, and at the exact time anticipated, I heard ground control speaking to Valentina before she was actually in orbit. By that time, I was approaching the territory of the Soviet Union, and I was eagerly awaiting the moment when she would finish reporting to ground control that she was in a state of weightlessness and that all was well. I did not interrupt her conversation with the ground, but then, when I saw that she had finished speaking, I cut in. There, actually, our space rendezvous began. It began with my congratulating her on her successful launching. As the Vostok capsule had no orbital maneuvering capability, Baikovsky and Tereshkova were unable to perform an actual rendezvous. And though during Tereshkova's first orbit, the two spacecraft came within 5 kilometers of each other, neither cosmonaut reported visually sighting the other. They did, however, enjoy excellent radio communications, with Baikovsky reporting that Tereshkova was singing me songs. But gradually the two drifted further and further apart, eventually drifting out of radio communications range. On her third orbit, Tereshkova received a call from an ecstatic Premier Nikita Khrushchev. As Tereshkova later joked, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev has become a real radio operator. We followed all the radio communication rules in our conversation. We used the call signs and ended by saying over. In recognition of her historic achievement, Tereshkova was also promoted mid-flight to the rank of captain. But while Khrushchev could not have known it, not all was well aboard Vostok 6. As the mission progressed, Tereshkova developed an ever-worsening cramp in her right leg, an unscratchable itch beneath one of her biomedical sensors, and a persistent pain where a spacesuit helmet ring chafed against her shoulder. At one point, she also became nauseous and vomited in the capsule, although she adamantly blamed this incident on bad food and not space sickness. But the most persistent problem Tereshkova faced during her flight was with communications. In his final report, General Kamenin accused Tereshkova of being out of her depth and berated her for failing to report key information to her flight controllers. Her responses regarding her health were often vague and evasive, and she often failed to answer at all. During one such period of radio silence, ground controllers suspected that a radio receiver might have failed and attempted to relay their messages through Baikovsky aboard Vostok 5. However, Baikovsky reported that, "I have tried myself to contact her without success, but I do not think there is any reason for concern." In desperation, the controllers switched on the onboard television camera, only to discover that an ill and exhausted Tereshkova had fallen into a deep sleep. Reluctantly, they awoke her by switching the cabin lights on and off and reminded her of her upcoming maneuvering exercises. Though the Vostok capsule was designed to be fully automated, Tereshkova was instructed to practice manual maneuvers in case the automatic systems failed, and she was forced to manually align the capsule for re-entry. But this too went poorly, with Tereshkova struggling to keep the capsule under control. This drew the ire of General Kamenin, who declared Tereshkova inept and out of her depth. Tereshkova, however, tells a very different story. While performing routine checks, she claims she discovered that an engineer had misprogrammed the re-entry sequence, causing the capsule to orient itself in the wrong direction. This means that the retro rockets, instead of slowing Vostok 6 down and initiating atmospheric re-entry, would have boosted it into a higher orbit and left Tereshkova stranded in space. Despite the seriousness of the error, Tereshkova pleaded that the engineer responsible not be punished. Her request was accepted, but only on the condition that the incident remain top secret. Over the night of June 18th to 19th, cosmonauts Yuri Gagarin, German Titov, and Andrei Nikolaev, along with a team of engineers, worked out a set of corrections to the guidance computer, which they relayed to Tereshkova the next morning. With the corrections correctly entered and a potentially fatal mishap averted, Tereshkova prepared to initiate re-entry and return to Earth. Meanwhile, Baikovsky was also preparing to return home. Though it was originally intended for him to remain in orbit for 8 days, his lower-than-expected orbit was not expected to remain stable for that long. Furthermore, high solar flare activity had caused the Earth's atmosphere to expand, further hastening the decay of his orbit. Thus, on June 17th, the decision was made to bring Bukovsky home on the 19th, 5 days after his launch. Though less fraught than Tereshkova's flight, Bukovsky's mission had not been without incident. Like Tereshkova, he too had developed a pressure point under his spacesuit's helmet ring and found the helmet's communication headset uncomfortable. He also encountered some minor digestive issues, leading to an unintentionally comedic exchange. On the 5th day of his mission, Bukovsky sent a Morse code message to Mission Control reporting that at 9:05 had a cosmic stuk. Stuk in Russian means knock or bang, and ground controllers feared that Vostok 5 had been struck by a meteor. Frantically, they compiled a list of urgent questions before contacting Bukovsky about the nature of the impact. Confused, Bukovsky stated that he had no idea what they were talking about. When reminded of his message, Bukovsky burst out laughing, explaining that he had meant to type stool, not stuk. After days of constipation, Bukovsky had finally managed to use the bathroom, another triumphant space first for the Soviet Union. Though second to launch, Valentina Tereshkova was the first to head home. At 9:39 a.m. Moscow time on June the 19th, ground controllers initiated the re-entry sequence using solar sensors to orientate the capsule and igniting the retro rocket. Once again, Tereshkova's communications difficulties returned, and she failed to confirm over radio any of the key milestones in the re-entry sequence. Such confirmations were deemed essential, for previous missions had encountered serious difficulties with the re-entry sequence, particularly the separation of the main descent module from the instrument module. Tereshkova would later claim that she had indeed transmitted all the required signals via Morse code, but that no one had received them. It's now believed that she selected the wrong transmission frequency. Whatever the case, communication with Vostok 6 soon cut off completely as the capsule entered ionization blackout, the sheath of hot ionized gas forming around the hull, blocking out all radio waves as the spacecraft streaked like a meteorite through the atmosphere. Eventually, however, a tracking ship in the South Atlantic picked up Tereshkova's signal, indicating all was well. 7 kilometers above the Earth, the capsule's parachute deployed and the hatch blew off, and a few seconds later, Tereshkova's ejection seat ignited and launched her clear of the spacecraft. As her own parachute deployed, Tereshkova opened her helmet faceplate to get a better look at the landing site. Though she had been warned not to look up, she did so anyway, and was promptly struck by a piece of debris, which left a small cut and a bruise on her nose. In a particularly hair-raising moment, the wind threatened to push Tereshkova into a nearby lake, but at the last minute it shifted direction. At 11:20 a.m. Moscow time, Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, landed safely in a field on the Pavinsky Collective Farm, 600 kilometers northeast of Karaganda in the Altai region of Kazakhstan. Over the course of 2 days, 22 hours and 50 minutes, 70 minutes short of a full 3 days, she had orbited the Earth 48 times, exceeding the flight time of all American astronauts combined. Her flight also marked the end of the Vostok program and made her the last woman to fly into space alone. Local farm workers soon arrived at the landing site bearing food, which Tereshkova gladly traded for the barely touched food inside the capsule, much to the annoyance of flight surgeons who wanted to monitor her caloric intake during the mission. An hour later, the rescue helicopter arrived and airlifted Tereshkova away. 90 minutes later, Vostok 5 initiated retrofire and re-entered the atmosphere. As in earlier missions, the descent and instrument modules failed to fully separate and remained connected by a bundle of cables, causing the spacecraft to tumble wildly until the cables finally burned through. Though the extreme forces caused Bukovsky to strike his face against his helmet faceplate, he was not seriously injured. At 2:06 p.m. Moscow time, Bukovsky safely parachuted to the ground some 800 kilometers from Tereshkova's landing site. He had been in space for 4 days, 23 hours and 7 minutes, setting a solo spaceflight endurance record that stands to this very day. Overnight, Valentina Tereshkova became a celebrity, feted across the Soviet Union and the world. She and Bukovsky were awarded the Order of Lenin and the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, and on June 22, 1963, appeared with Premier Khrushchev in Red Square before a crowd of millions. From then on, Tereshkova's life became a grueling whirlwind of parades, news interviews, factory visits, and other public appearances, with the First Lady of Space visiting an astonishing 42 countries over the next 7 years. So tightly did the Soviet state control every aspect of Tereshkova's life that she was even pressured by Khrushchev into marrying a fellow cosmonaut, Andrei Nikolaev. The two had struck up a romance during Tereshkova's training at Star City, and the premier believed such a cosmic marriage would have enormous propaganda value. The wedding took place at a Moscow registry office on November 3, 1963, the ceremony being officiated by Khrushchev himself, and was followed by a lavish reception at a former Tsarist palace in the Lenin Hills. 9 months later, Tereshkova gave birth to a daughter, Elena, the first person born to parents who had both traveled into space. Sadly, the cosmic marriage was not to last, and Tereshkova and Nikolaev gradually drifted apart, finally separating in 1977. And while Tereshkova's achievement served as inspiration for millions of women around the world, it did not, as she had hoped, pave the way for other women to follow in her footsteps. Her selection and mission had been little more than a piece of propaganda, a means of claiming yet another spaceflight first over the Americans. The situation was no better across the Atlantic. Despite the exceptional performance of the women pilots known as the Mercury 13, NASA in the early 1960s had no intention of recruiting female astronauts. Though sexism certainly played a role in this policy, there was also a large practical component. Early on, NASA had decided that astronauts should be recruited from the ranks of military test pilots, an occupation not open to American women. Indeed, even if the Mercury 13 had been men, they would still not have qualified. Thus, thanks to these barriers and the accelerating pace of the space race, it would be another 20 years before another woman flew into space. But it would not be for lack of trying. On July 17, 1962, members of the Mercury 13 persuaded Representative Victor Anfuso to convene public hearings before a special subcommittee of the House Committee on Science and Astronautics on the subject of gender discrimination in the space program. Yet despite 2 days of testimony from members of the 13 as well as Mercury 7 astronauts, the committee returned no recommendations and no action was taken. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, rumors were circulating that another woman would soon follow Valentina Tereshkova into space. The woman in question was Marina Popovich, wife of cosmonaut Pavel Popovich and one of the original 18 finalists for the first woman cosmonaut group. Despite being an accomplished pilot with an engineering degree, Popovich had been disqualified because, at the time, General Kamanin was only looking for parachutists. In 1964, Popovich enrolled at the Air Force Test Pilot School in Akhtubinsk and began training under Stefan Mikhian, nephew of Artem Mikhian of legendary aircraft design bureau Mikhail Gurerovich, aka MiG. By the time she graduated, Popovich had qualified on the MiG 16, 17, and 21 fighters, logged over 6,000 flying hours, and risen to the rank of colonel in the Soviet Air Force. And on June 10, 1964, she broke the sound barrier in a MiG-21, becoming only the third woman to do so after American pilot Jacqueline Cochran and French pilot Jacqueline Auriol. Upon completion of her training, Popovich applied again to become a cosmonaut candidate and was subjected to a grueling battery of tests over the course of 40 days. She passed every single one, only to be informed that she was ineligible because she had a child. Husband Pavel was furious, demanding to know why his wife had been allowed to take the tests if she had already been disqualified. Yet despite this moment of loyal support, in reality, Pavel Popovich was intensely jealous of his wife's aviation career and grew increasingly bitter as time went on. This simmering resentment came to a boil on April 11, 1966, when cosmonauts Popovich, Yuri Gagarin, Viktor Gorbachev, Andrei Nikolaev, and their wives were in Kiev entertaining delegates from the 23rd Communist Party Congress. At the reception, Marina spotted Pavel embracing Gorbachev's wife, Valentina, and confronted him, whereupon Pavel lashed out angrily, striking Marina and berating her. This in turn prompted Marina's brother, also in attendance, to punch Pavel in the face, giving him a black eye. Unsurprisingly, the couple divorced soon after. But Marina's career only prospered, for in 1978 she accepted an invitation from Ukrainian aircraft designer Oleg Antonov to become the Soviet Union's first female test pilot. Until her retirement in 1984, she flew more than 40 different types of aircraft and set nearly 100 flight records, many of which stand to this day. The propaganda mission accomplished, the first women astronaut group was dissolved in 1969. It would be another 13 years before another woman flew into space when another Russian, 34-year-old Svetlana Savitskaya, blasted into orbit aboard Soyuz T-7 on August 19, 1982. She was followed the next year by the first American female astronaut, Sally Ride, while on July 17, 1984, Savitskaya returned to orbit aboard Soyuz T-12, becoming the first woman to fly into space twice and the first to perform an extravehicular activity, or spacewalk. As for the First Lady of Space herself, Valentina Tereshkova, she hoped to fly again and graduated from the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy in an attempt to re-qualify for spaceflight. However, following the tragic death of Yuri Gagarin in a plane crash on March 27, 1968, the Soviet government made it clear that they could not risk the life of another national hero, and Tereshkova was permanently grounded. Upon the dissolution of the first woman cosmonaut group in 1969, Tereshkova remained in the Soviet space program and became a cosmonaut training instructor. That same year, on January 22nd, she narrowly escaped death when one Viktor Ilyin, bitter over his recent conscription into the Soviet army, attacked a motorcade celebrating the successful rendezvous and docking of the Soyuz 4 and 5 spacecraft. Hoping to assassinate Premier Leonid Brezhnev, Ilyin opened fire on a limousine which he believed held the Soviet leader, but was actually carrying cosmonauts Valentina Tereshkova, Andrei Nikolaev, Alexei Leonov, and Georgy Beregovoy. While Ilyin succeeded in killing the car's driver and seriously wounding a motorcycle outrider, he missed the cosmonauts who, while superficially wounded by flying glass, were otherwise unharmed. In her appointed role as national hero and global ambassador, Tereshkova took on a variety of political roles over her career, serving as a member of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union from 1966 to 1975, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and Presidium of the Supreme Soviet from 1969 to 1991. She was also leader of the Committee for Soviet Women, a member of the World Peace Council and International Women's Democratic Federation, and led Soviet delegations to the 1975 UN Conference for the International Women's Year in Mexico City and the 1980 World Conference on Women in Copenhagen. By the time she retired from the Air Force in 1997, she had also attained the rank of Major General, the only woman in Russian history to do so. In 1977, Tereshkova earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering, and when in 1978 it was announced that the Soviet space program was once again accepting female cosmonaut candidates, she underwent medical evaluations to re-qualify for spaceflight. Unfortunately, she failed the tests and never flew into space again, though during the evaluations she met and fell in love with a physician, Yuli Shaposhnivkov. The two married in 1982 after the granting of Tereshkova's divorce from Andrei Nikolaev and remained together until Shaposhnikov's death in 1999. Despite the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Tereshkova remained active in politics, being elected to the Regional Duma, or Parliament, of Yaroslavl Oblast in 2008 and to the National State Duma in 2011, 2016, and 2021 as a member of Vladimir Putin's United Russian Party. She currently serves as Deputy Chair for the Committee for International Affairs and Deputy Chair of the Committee on the Federal Structure and Local Government. Like many former and current astronauts, Tereshkova claimed that her experience has profoundly changed her perspective on life, the Earth, and politics, stating that the Earth is a planet at once so beautiful and so fragile. When you are up there, you are homesick for Earth as your cradle. When you get back, you just want to get down and hug it. Americans, Asians, everyone who has seen it says the same thing: how unbelievably beautiful the Earth is and how very important it is to look after it. Our planet suffers from human activity, from fires, from war. We have to preserve it. People shouldn't waste money on wars, but come together to discuss how to defend the world from threats like asteroids coming from outer space. Nonetheless, Tereshkova has remained an ardent supporter of President Vladimir Putin, voting in 2020 to lift presidential term limits and stating that, quote, "An awful lot depends on leaders. Putin took over a country that was on the brink of disintegration. He rebuilt it and gave us hope again. You only have to see how he is received, how people respond to him. He is a splendid person." And in 2022, Tereshkova voted in favor of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In response, both the EU and the United States Department of the Treasury added her to the specially designated nationals and blocked persons list, freezing her foreign assets, preventing her from entering member states, and preventing American and EU citizens from doing business with her. And yet, in spite of her politics, Tereshkova remains a pioneer and an inspiration to millions, her historic 1963 mission opening the door for women around the world to pursue their dreams of outer space. Of the 500 people who have flown in space since 1961, around 11% have been women, although this number is steadily growing and includes luminaries such as American astronaut Peggy Whitson, who currently holds the American and world female record for most days in space at 665. Though originally chosen to be a Gagarin in a skirt and a tool of Cold War propaganda, Valentina Tereshkova remains nonetheless proved that for women as well as men, the sky is not the limit.